You are standing in a field. The sun has just begun to rise. The air carries the scent of grass and smoke. Around you, about 30 people are moving, some digging for roots, some starting a fire, some gazing out toward the distant horizon. Nobody owns this field. Nobody owns the food in it. Nobody owns anyone. For roughly 300,000 years, this was the default state of every human being who ever lived on Earth. No kings, no soldiers, no chains, no borders. No one who could look another person in the eye and say, "You belong to me." Then something changed, and once it changed, it could never go back to the way it was. This is the story of how your ancestors created war and slavery, not because they were evil, not because they were stupid, but because of a single decision made roughly 12,000 years ago, a decision that, at the time, looked like the smartest thing humanity had ever done. For most of human prehistory, your ancestors lived in small mobile bands of 20 to 50 people. Anthropologists call these groups hunter-gatherer societies, but that label barely begins to capture what made them extraordinary. These were not desperate, starving people clinging to survival. The archaeological and anthropological record tells a very different story. Richard Bourchier-Lee, an anthropologist at the University of Toronto, spent years living alongside the Kungsan people of the Kalahari Desert, one of the last surviving hunter-gatherer groups on Earth. What he found stunned the academic world. The Kung worked an average of 15 to 20 hours per week to meet all of their nutritional needs. The rest of the time, they rested, talked, played, made music, and raised their children. Lee published his findings in 1968. Economist and anthropologist Marshall Salins read them and coined a phrase that has stayed with anthropology ever since. He called hunter-gatherer societies the original affluent society, not wealthy in material possessions, but wealthy in time and freedom. Your ancestors were not poor. By many measures, they were profoundly free. And here is the part that matters. In those small mobile bands, almost nothing could be permanently owned. You could only carry what you could carry. If you hoarded food, it rotted. If you hoarded tools, they slowed you down. If one person in a band accumulated more than the others, the whole band would move on and balance restored itself. Archaeologist David Graeber and anthropologist David Wengrow, in their landmark 2021 work The Dawn of Everything, examined thousands of years of skeletal and archaeological evidence. Their conclusion was striking. For the vast majority of human prehistory, evidence of violent conflict between groups, war as we understand it, is almost entirely absent. Isolated violence? Yes. Occasional raids. But organized, sustained warfare? The skeletal record simply does not show it. Your ancestors were not angels, but they were not warriors either. So what happened? The answer begins in a thin, crescent-shaped strip of land, stretching from present-day Iraq through Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and into southern Turkey. Archaeologists call it the Fertile Crescent. Roughly 12,000 years ago, something extraordinary happened here. For reasons still debated, whether climate shifts, population pressure, or simple experimentation, groups of humans began doing something no creature on Earth had ever done at that scale before. They stopped following food. They started growing it. The first domesticated crops, emmer wheat, einkorn wheat, and barley, emerged in this region around 10,000 BCE. Within just a few thousand years, the practice had spread across the Middle East, into Europe, Asia, and Africa. Humanity had learned to farm, and farming, as it turned out, changed absolutely everything. Here is what farming gave your ancestors: a stable food supply, surplus, the ability to feed more people from less land, villages, then towns, then cities. Population growth that the hunter-gatherer way of life could never have sustained. Here is what farming took away. When you plant a field, you must stay close to it. When your wheat is ready to harvest, you cannot simply walk away. When you build a granary to store that wheat, you have created something that no hunter-gatherer band ever had to worry about. You have created something worth stealing. And once something worth stealing existed, for the very first time in human history, it ignited organized violence. The earliest clear archaeological evidence of large-scale organized warfare appears almost precisely where and when you would expect, in the ancient Near East, shortly after the agricultural revolution took hold. At a site called Crow Creek in South Dakota, far from the Fertile Crescent, but following the same agricultural pattern thousands of years later. Archaeologists uncovered a mass grave dating to around 1325 CE. Inside were the remains of nearly 500 people. The research revealed evidence of scalping, dismemberment, and mutilation. This was not an accident or a plague. This was a massacre. The same pattern appears again and again, all over the world, in the archaeological record, always arriving after agriculture, almost never before it. Why? Because before farming, there was nothing worth fighting over at the cost of organized violence. Hunter-gatherers could move. Their food moved with the animals and the seasons. You cannot steal a migration route. You cannot occupy a berry bush. But a field of wheat, a granary full of barley, a herd of domesticated cattle, these are fixed. These are valuable. These were worth fighting over. James C. Scott, a political scientist at Yale University and the author of Against the Grain, argues that early agricultural states were fundamentally built on the control of grain because grain, unlike root vegetables or fruit, can be easily measured, stored, taxed, and seized. It was the most primitive form of extractable wealth. And wherever extractable wealth exists, there will always be someone willing to use force to take it. Your ancestors did not invent war because they became more violent. They invented war because they became more settled, because they finally had something they could not afford to lose. And this is where slavery began to take shape. Because once you have organized warfare, groups of armed men fighting other groups of armed men, prisoners become inevitable. For hunter-gatherer bands, a prisoner was a problem. You could not easily absorb a captive into a mobile group. You could not feed them indefinitely. In many documented cases, prisoners taken during raids were simply killed. But for early agricultural societies, a prisoner was something else entirely. A prisoner was labor. And labor in an agricultural economy is worth more than anything else. The earliest written records of slavery come from ancient Mesopotamia, the civilization that grew up between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now Iraq. On clay tablets dating back roughly 4,000 years, Sumerian scribes recorded the buying, selling, and ownership of human beings with the same matter-of-fact calm they used to record grain transactions. These were not metaphorical slaves. They were real people captured in war, born into servitude, or sold by desperate families during famine. People who were legally defined as property. People who could be bought and sold. People who could be worked to death. Archaeologist Guillermo Algaze of the University of California, San Diego, has conducted extensive research into the expansion of early Mesopotamian civilization. His work shows that the growth of the first cities, Uruk, Eridu, and was inseparable from the exploitation of both agricultural surplus and coerced labor. The monuments your ancestors built, the irrigation canals they dug, the temples they raised. Much of it was built on the backs of people who had no choice. Slavery was not an aberration of early civilization. It was one of its founding mechanisms. But here is the part of the story where you should stop and think. The people who created these systems, the earliest farmers, the first warriors, the Sumerian merchants who traded in human lives, did not think of themselves as monsters. They thought they were being practical. When an early Mesopotamian city-state defeated a neighboring group in battle, taking prisoners as slaves was not seen as cruelty. It was seen as mercy. The alternative, in many ancient contexts, was simply to slaughter the defeated enemies entirely. When a farmer hired armed men to protect his granary from raiders, he was not building a war machine. He was protecting his family's survival. When those armed men, now a professional military class, began demanding payment, land, and authority, the farmer who had hired them had almost no choice but to comply. Coercive power, once created, is nearly impossible to undo. This is the trap your ancestors fell into. Not through malice, not through stupidity, but through a series of decisions that were individually rational, yet together produced consequences no single person could have predicted. The farmer who planted the first field did not know he was inventing war. The general who took the first prisoners did not know he was inventing slavery. The scribe who recorded the first property transaction did not know he was creating a system of inequality that would persist for the next 10,000 years. They were simply solving the problems right in front of them. And in solving those problems, they created the world we still live in. By the time the great ancient civilizations, Egypt, Babylon, Greece, Rome, and China, reached their peak, The structures your ancestors had accidentally built were fully established and deeply entrenched. A small class of landowners and rulers controlled the surplus that agriculture produced. A large class of farmers, laborers, and slaves produced that surplus. A professional military class enforced the arrangement, and a priestly or administrative class provided the ideological framework that made all of it seem natural, inevitable, and ordained by the gods. In ancient Athens, celebrated as the birthplace of democracy, approximately 1/3 of the population were enslaved people. The philosophers who debated freedom in the public square were often served by people who had none. In ancient Rome, at the height of the empire, historians estimate that between 30 and 40% of the population of Italy were slaves. The Roman economy did not merely use slave labor. It was structurally dependent on it. The inequality that your ancestors created 12,000 years ago had, by this point, become the invisible water that everyone swam in. It was no longer a choice. It was simply the world. And what does that story leave you with? The skeletal record shows that the average hunter-gatherer of 15,000 years ago was, by many measurable standards, healthier than the average early farmer. Taller, better nourished, less susceptible to infectious disease, less likely to die in organized violence. Agriculture gave humanity cities, writing, science, philosophy, art, and ultimately the technological civilization you live in today. The trade-off was real, and the gains were enormous. But the cost was real too, and it was paid disproportionately by those at the bottom, by the farmers who grew food they did not always get to keep, by the soldiers who fought wars they did not start, by the enslaved people who built monuments they would never own. The world your ancestors accidentally built was not inevitable. There were moments, and David Graeber and David Wengrow document many of them in The Dawn of Everything, where early societies made different choices, where they built complex civilizations without kings, where they organized cities without slaves, where they created surplus without conquest. You did not choose to be born into the inheritance your ancestors left you. The inequality, the legacy of coerced labor, the institutions built on violence, you inherited all of it without being asked. But you are the first species in the history of this planet capable of looking back at your own history clearly enough to understand how you got here. And that, at least, is something your ancestors, free and equal, under the same sky 300,000 years ago, could never have imagined. They just wanted to survive. They had no idea what they were building. There's one more thing worth saying before we close. When historians and archaeologists study the collapse of early civilizations, the fall of the Bronze Age around 1200 BCE, the slow implosion of the Western Roman Empire, the repeated cycles of city-states rising and crashing across Mesopotamia, they find the same pattern beneath nearly every collapse. Inequality had grown too extreme. The people producing the wealth had been squeezed too hard. The military class had become too expensive. The administrative class had grown too detached from the reality of ordinary survival. And at some point, the system that had begun with a single farmer planting a single field simply became too heavy to hold up. The people at the bottom stopped defending it. Sometimes they walked away. Sometimes they opened the gates to invaders. Sometimes they simply stopped working hard enough to sustain the pyramid above them. Your ancestors built these systems without knowing where they led. But eventually, they found their limits. Every system built on organized coercion, on the threat of violence used to extract labor and resources from the many for the benefit of the few, has, in the historical record, eventually reached a point where the cost of maintaining it exceeded the benefit of running it. That is not a political statement. That is just history. The same species that invented war also invented diplomacy. The same species that invented slavery also abolished it. In most of the world, within the last 2 centuries, after tens of thousands of years of its existence. The same species that built the first walled city to protect its grain also built the first court of law to deal with the problem of that grain being taken. Your ancestors were not locked into the world they built, and neither are you. You are standing in a field. The sun is still low. The air still carries the faint scent of something burning somewhere in the distance. But this time, you know exactly how the fire started. If you found this video useful and valuable, please give it a like. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and we'll see each other again in many more fascinating topics ahead.